Welcome to today's episode where we'll discuss whether the traitor Primarchs were right for turning against the Imperium. First, I'd like to profess that nobody is right really. The Imperium sucks. The Emperor sucks. Chaos sucks. This is 40K. No one is right, and everyone sucks, including your mom. The Primarchs get a small pass though. Imagine being born a godchild with a brain more powerful than a supercomputer and an ego large enough to have its own orbit. But they're still children nonetheless. You and 17 other galactic toddlers are tossed into a universe where literally no one else can relate to your divine struggle, and the one guy who could play Dad of the Century leaves for milk and never returns. Are we really surprised things went sideways? Honestly, the fact they didn't all throw tantrums that wiped out entire galaxies sooner is kind of impressive. Anyway, let's start with the Roid Rage Primarch Angron. Of all the Primarchs, you can't help but feel a little bad for the guy. He was in the midst of a war, ready to die on his home world, with his gladiator family in a blaze of honor and glory. And what happens? Well, Dad pops in with the teleportation jutsu and yanks him out of there. And the kicker? Big E totally had the firepower to win the fight and save Angron's buddies, but nah. Instead, he just left his friends to die there and invalidate his whole life's work. So now, Angron, fresh off the worst case of survivor's guilt in history, is told, hey, I know you're emotionally wrecked, but could you lead this legion of Space Marines on some casual intergalactic genocide? Thanks. For these reasons, Angron hated Big E from the start. And Angron wasn't shy about calling out the Emperor as a brutal tyrant, because, let's be real, he was completely spot on. But when you've got a piece of Dark Age tech living rent-free in your head, articulating your feelings becomes a bit tricky. Honestly, it wouldn't be shocking if Big E left that cursed thing in there on purpose. Angron's eventual revolt? Totally justified. 10 out of 10 would rebel again. When your mental state is already like a browser with 57 open tabs, setting the galaxy on fire feels pretty cathartic. Ah, Perturabo, another one of the Primarchs that desperately needed therapy. For centuries, he and his Iron Warriors were overworked employees of the Great Crusade, perpetually stuck in the most soul-crushing war zones imaginable. Imagine a 9-to-5 job, but the boss is a god who never remembers your name, and the only perks are existential dread and grimdark PTSD. The work was thankless, the recognition non-existent. Basically, it was like being the unpaid intern of the Imperium. Purdy thought his endless campaigns were a sign that Big E didn't appreciate him. But no, it turns out the Emperor's strategy was just the classic tough love approach. A little text saying, "Good job, champ, proud of you," could have gone a long way, but instead, Big E just ghosted him. The relentless grind finally took its toll on Purdy, and he snapped. His bitterness reached its grand finale, where he offed his adopted sister and obliterated Olympia, his own homeworld. He thought there was no redemption, and that the Emperor would never forgive him for his failures. So, he joined good old Horus for some rebellion. Purdy's fear of failure drove him to become the galaxy's most overzealous tool, pounding away at problems as if they were all nails in need of a good bashing. Ironically, the more he banged, the more he complained about being stuck in a hammer's life. Was the Emperor a teensy bit to blame for Purdy's downfall? Maybe. But let's be real, a 34-week course in empathy and Lego building might have done wonders. And then we have Magnus. He was the guy who reads one Wikipedia article and suddenly thinks he's a Nobel Prize laureate. Arrogant as all hell, he strutted around like he was always the smartest dude in the room. So, when he found out about Horus's treachery, he rushed to tell Dad. But instead of sending a quick text message, he punches a hole straight through the webway and absolutely wrecks the Golden Throne. This webway was the equivalent of the Emperor's Lamborghini. Magnus knew he was in deep shit, couldn't even bring himself to warn the Emperor about Horus, so he ran like a bitch. This led to the Emperor sending the Space Wolves to Prospero to escort Magnus back to Terra. Magnus, feeling extremely guilty, sends away his fleets and turns off his communications. He decides that because of his choices, his world, and his legion, the Thousand Sons had to die. With his phone on airplane mode, Leman Russ could not reach his brother, leading him to attack the planet. In the ensuing duel, Magnus's soul is shattered. He thinks he's beyond redemption in the eyes of the Emperor and turns to chaos. Magnus is the ultimate case of you played yourself. His downfall wasn't some grand betrayal orchestrated by Big E. It was his own toxic cocktail of a superiority complex and an ego. Curze is an interesting character to say the least. He was crazy. Like, really, really crazy. If you think your childhood was rough, imagine growing up on a planet where crime is basically a sport. Nostromo was a dystopian hellhole, even by 40K standards, which is saying a lot. It was a planet of murderers, rapists, kidnappers, and thieves. Curze had no moral compass because, well, there was literally no one to give him one. Nostromo was so vile that Curze decided the best way to end their criminal ways was to nuke it. So that's what he did. As if growing up in a murder-verse wasn't enough, Curze had the delightful bonus of psychic visions. Not just any visions of the future either. Nope. He got to enjoy the slow-burn mental torture of watching his own death, courtesy of an Imperial assassin. And who was likely sending this killer? His dear old dad, the Emperor. This implied he was destined to betray the Imperium, and he believed his fate was unavoidable, and prophecies were self-fulfilling. So, he embraced it. If he's doomed to betray the Imperium anyway, might as well go full villain arc, right? Plus, the rest of the Imperium always looked down upon him for the atrocities and horrors he committed, so why not give them a big fuck you? It's important to note he never turned to chaos, though. Even the Big Four wouldn't touch that crazy bastard with a 10-foot pole. Did Curze have a valid reason for betraying the Emperor? Not really. 0 out of 10, he needed a therapist. Now we have Lorgar. This dude was an absolute idiot. While his brothers were out speed-running galaxy domination during the Great Crusade, Lorgar and his word-bearers were basically in slow-mo. Conquering? Nah, they were too busy remodeling temples and writing God Emperor fanfiction. Instead of leading armies, he spent his time handing out "Have you heard the word of the Emperor?" pamphlets. He was unsuited to be a general, and should have been allowed to stay home writing his philosophy books. He was a zealous, religious nerd, and worshipped the Emperor, even though his dad specifically said not to do that. Remember, Big E did not want humans worshipping any type of god, including himself. Instead of a timeout, Big E decided to vaporize their home world of Monarchia as punishment. Dad of the year, don't you think? In his moment of grief and shame, Lorgar sought comfort in the absolute worst places. It made him realize something. There was a divine being worthy of his endless worship, but it wasn't Big E. Honestly, you can't even be that mad about Lorgar's betrayal. Don't force a round peg into square hole, and then be surprised when they turn into a massive a-hole. 8 out of 10 would betray again. Mortarion's saga is like Angron's, but with a little more existential dread. You see, Morty spent his whole life dedicated to hating his adoptive father, the Pale King, who's basically a tyrant. He rallies a rebellion, gets all pumped up, and is on the brink of finally taking the old man down. He's close to delivering the final blow, but ultimately fails. Then the Emperor swoops in, swiping the kill. Mortarion's one reason for existing, his thirst for vengeance, is yanked away, leaving him with nothing. He despised the Pale King, but the Emperor showed up and proved that there's always bigger fish in the sea. Mortarion had simply traded one tyrant for another. And now he was told that he's going to be one of the Emperor's 18 new overlords, tasked with crushing dissent or snuffing out anyone who dares to disagree. Mortarion's grudge isn't just about the Emperor snatching away his vengeance, it's also about the Emperor's grand hypocrisy. Then we have Fulgrim. Fulgrim wasn't necessarily wrong or right. He was just slowly corrupted by the Layer Blade, a slaaneshi demon sword, on a planet that he purged. It managed to work on his inner paranoia and insecurities, and turned him against his brothers and his dad. 0 out of 10. Not Fulgrim's fault. Finally, we have the big bad wolf, Horus Lupercal. His betrayal was twofold, one for existential reasons, and the other was a product of his upbringing. You see, Horus was literally molded by Big E to be the apex conqueror. He was designed to be the perfect warlord, but when you've conquered everything, what's left? The answer is obviously to overthrow the guy who made you in the first place. He also had this creeping suspicion that after the Great Crusade, the Emperor would treat him and the other legions like the Thunder Warriors, throw them a thank you parade, and then promptly toss them into the nearest cosmic dumpster. It's hard to focus on being the War Master when you're constantly side-eyeing your own obituary. The second issue was that Horus disagreed with imperial taxes. He said, fuck the IRS. So, seeing the worlds he fought so hard to bring into the fold be forced into desperate rebellion because of totally unfair taxing regimes, he understandably lost it. To make things worse, The Imperium was slowly being run by bureaucratic pencil pushers who hadn't even fought in the wars that built the Imperium in the first place. These guys couldn't tell the difference between a lasgun and a letter opener, but thought they were fit to rule. Horus, ever the ambitious soul, looked at the Emperor's cushy throne and thought, I could do this way better. More glory, less paperwork. And, oh yeah, fewer taxes. Definitely fewer taxes. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. If there's any specific 40K lore, topics, or conversations you'd like me to discuss, please feel free to drop a comment below.